And so I'm very, very happy to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Wolfgang Stein, who studied psychology and pedagogics, and he is engaged as a voluntary member of the Independent Commission for the Processing of Sexual Abuse in the Diocese of Magdeburg, as a voluntary member of the Survivors Board at the Independent Commissioner for Child Sexual Abuse, and as a voluntary member of the Central Patient and Relatives Advisory Board of the German Center for Mental Health. This is really a precious occasion because we have the chance to listen to a presentation about victims' participation in research and to have the opportunity to hear the contribution from a person who can show both sides of the issue, from the point of view of the victim, the survivor, and from the point of view of the safeguarders committed every day in the work about this. So welcome, Mr. Stein, and please.
Buongiorno, good day, bonjour, buenos dias. I work for safeguarding and child protection as a volunteer. And in this room, I can see guardian angels. Welcome. My topic is victims' participation in research, and I would like to share some thoughts with you on how affected people are involved in consulting processes, decision-making processes, and especially research projects. In doing so, I try to take the perspective of those affected. And with the lyrics of the Bee Gees, I beg your pardon, because it's only words, and words are all I have to take your hearts away. When the environment of people is studied, people whose environment is affected are involved. Civic participation or public participation begins with the participation in simple surveys about projects of responsible authorities, and it ends with citizens' initiatives where citizens want to change or shape their own environment. In Switzerland, citizens make important political decisions in referendums. My presentation is not about general citizen participation. I will focus on the involvement of affected people in consulting processes and research projects. My hypothesis is that being affected leads to practical knowledge. Practical knowledge must, in my opinion, be equivalent to professional knowledge. For me, research involving affected people is like interdisciplinary research. It is like research by researchers and different areas of, and with researchers of different areas of knowledge. For professional training, we need to learn for 15 or 20 years. And with the first degree after school as a craftsman or a university bachelor, the training is often not yet completed, but continues. Only a few people can achieve an outstanding position as a researcher and university professor or as a chief physician. The path to this needs decades of learning, significant financial investments, and relentless diligence. It is only too understandable for me that the experts in science or in practice ensure that their knowledge is and their professional skills are valued and recognized. And this is especially true for experts in leadership positions. But how do you gain practical experience? It is often acquired passively. What does it feel like to be neglected, physically or mentally abused or sexually abused? How does it feel to be hospitalized for a disease? What goes on in a person facing serious surgery? What goes on? What problems do members or church councils, ambulance services, or family helpers need to solve, to volunteer? Suffering or dealing with stressful situation is not taught in school, and you cannot study it. You don't have to make a specific effort to have a bad and stressful experience. We gain practical knowledge through calamities or violence. They are sometimes so hard that people break underneath the burden. However, if those affected can bring their experience to advisory boards, decision-making boards, or research projects, this is an extremely valuable and enriching asset. And should that be equal to tediously acquired expertise? For participative research, the answer is yes. We should encourage and leverage practical knowledge. Here my basic idea. Michael Wright conceptualized a model with 9 stages of participation in health research. It follows the principle that participation indicates decision power. The greater the decision power, the greater the degree of participation. According to Wright, this thought is intended to serve the systematic development of a participative practice of health promotion and thus the process of participative quality assurance. Participative quality assurance envisions increasing the effectiveness of environment-specific offers by increasing the involvement of the target groups of the measures or in all phases of problem determination, project planning, project implementation, and project evaluation. True participation ensures equal collaboration between professionals, experts by experience, as well as private and public funders, and it offers participation from the beginning and the transfer and sharing of decision power. I chose 3 examples, namely the establishment of a German Center of Mental Health, then the Survivors Board, a council of affected people at the Independent Commissioner for Child Sexual Abuse Issues, and the current and future handling of sexual abuse of the German Bishops' Conference. First, the German Center for Mental Health. In the guideline dated 10th June of 2020 to promote concept development for the establishment of German Center of Mental Health, it is stated that the causes and mechanisms of the disease are still poorly understood in many cases of mental illness. New findings and technological developments are therefore necessary to develop more effective prevention, diagnosis, and therapy procedures that are aligned with human needs. In order to make a strong German contribution to the development of the research field, the Federal Ministry of Education and Research is promoting the establishment of a German Center of Mental Health to ensure that the needs of patients and their relatives are adequately considered. They or their representatives must be appropriately involved in all phases of the planning, execution, and implementation of the research result, for example, in the form of an advisory board. The overall concept should contain a comprehensive strategy across centers that describes the planned participatory process and characteristics. The German Center of Mental Health will be established in 6 locations. There are clinics for psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychosomatics, and children and adolescent psychology, as well as clinical psychology institutions in networks in Berlin, Mannheim, Tübingen, Jena, München, and Bochum. The link is a central patient and relative advisory board, a so-called triological council. The council is formed by representatives from every location, including a chief physician and members with experience as patients or as relatives. All are equal. Patient and public involvement aims at integrating patients and relatives as well as the general public as active partners into the research process, thereby increasing quality, relevance, and accountability of the research as well as reducing costs. The German Center will realize participatory research at every of its 6 sites, elements of what will be implemented in all their studies. According to the Wright and colleagues' model of participation, true participation involves some form of decision competence and shared power, which goes beyond inviting opinions of service users and relatives. Participatory research at the German Center thus includes the involvement of experts by experience with decision competence in the conception, implementation, evaluation, and dissemination of research projects. To allow for the consideration of research priorities of patients and relative user-initiated project formats will also be realized at the German Center. The Patient and Relatives Advisory Board has recently suggested a study to investigate the research preferences of thousands of patients and relatives in Germany on a large scale using focus groups, crowdsourcing, and survey methods. The goal of the project is the identification of a top 10 priority list for research topics from the perspective of people with lived experience that could serve as a compass not only for German Center research, but also for other national research and funding initiatives. Based on this large sample of patients and relatives, the project seeks to furthermore establish a representative patients and relative register, which will be largely user-controlled, that will allow the reinvestigation of users' preferences periodically, and that will also allow the investigation of other research questions which are of relevance of individuals with lived experience. And now to the Survivors Board. The legal basis for the Survivors Board at the Independent Commissioner for Child Sexual Abuse Issues is an administrative regulation on the composition, tasks, and compensation of the board. The Survivors Board is designed to ensure the structured involvement of affected people on a federal level, to advocate for the interests of people affected by sexualized violence, and to provide more enforcement to the work of the Independent Commissioner for Child Sexual Abuse Issues. The call for applications was published in autumn 2014 and targeted towards public authorities, organizations, and clubs. More than 250 affected people applied for the 15 places and went through the application procedure at that time. Members are survivors of sexual violence in childhood and adolescence within different contexts, including family, church, school, sports, or organized sexual and ritual violence. We have individual experience-based knowledge as well as specific expertise. Members are entitled to the right of initiative and supervision, and we are supported by a branch office. Yet the volunteering exceeded the effort of a typical voluntary work, and therefore the members of the Survivors Board took a stand for a fair allowance. The monthly flat rate expense allowance is €700 and is secured in the annual Federal Budget Act. This calculation takes into the account the participation in 2 full-day meetings per month, the necessary preparation and follow-up, as well as other tasks related to the participation in the committees. The allowance is not start of the monetization of voluntary work. The voluntary work is not supposed to become paid work. Civic engagement stays voluntary, complementary, and for the common good. However, an imbalance develops in collaboration with professionals if some are paid for the common tasks and others are not. Reverend Kapler had told about this imbalance before. The principle that expert knowledge and practical knowledge are equal and complementary has to prevail. Now I come to the work in the diocese. The German Catholic Bishops' Conference worked with the Independent Commissioner for Child Sexual Abuse Issues with the involvement of members of the Survivors Board to develop the joint declaration on firm criteria and standards for independent processing of sexual abuse at the Catholic Church in Germany and adopted it in 2020. Each diocese shall establish an independent commission for the processing of sexual abuse and shall also appoint an advisory board for affected people for their participation. The advisory board of affected people also sends 2 of its members to the respective committee. The example for the diocesan independent commissions is the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and for the diocesan advisory boards of affected people, it's the Survivors Board. Also, the allowance is guided by the Survivors Board. Originally, it differed between the dioceses. By now, the German Catholic Bishops' Conference suggested to treat the members of the diocesan independent commissions and the advisory boards equally, guided by the independent commissioner, and therefore all members should receive €700 per month. Contrary to the Survivors Board, at the independent commissioner, the dioceses currently don't manage to recruit enough affected people to the advisory boards. There are 2 reasons for this, as I think. On the one hand, the selection of appointment procedure requires a written application disclosing the affected people's history as well as exposing them to a selection based on eligibility and motivation. Affected people consider this as inappropriate. On the other hand, applications are addressed to the dioceses, which from the perspective of the people affected by sexual abuse in church-based contexts are the perpetrator organizations. Both hurdles are hindering the participation of affected people in the Catholic Church. A new process shows that the German Catholic Bishops' Conference has now understood what participation means for those affected. For this reason, the 2022 Autumn General Meeting of the German Catholic Bishops' Conference decided to restructure the topic of sexual abuse and experiences of violence. It aims to effectively and continuously improve the protection of children, adolescents, and vulnerable adults from sexual abuse and experience of violence in the diocese. For this purpose, the regulations and measures in the area of prevention, intervention, and refurbishment are further developed, and the needs for the affected persons and their perspective are considered and included. The German Catholic Bishops' Conference appoints an expert council. 2 of the up to 10 members will be sent by the advisory board of affected people at the German Catholic Bishops' Conference, and the participants are convinced that consistent consideration and inclusion of the perspective of the affected person is essential within the context of sexualized violence. Now, what do those affected need from the professionals? If participation is taken seriously, we must leave the comfortable path that we are used to. New structures and ways of working are needed. Participation challenges us because it requires time, flexibility, and collaboration on equal terms. Trust must be built. The continuity and reliability of collaboration and the willingness to operate outside of hierarchies are important. The examples above show that we are not at the beginning. First, spaces for practicing and reflection must be created to ensure that stakeholders can learn together how best to achieve participation. People are given all the necessary information they need to participate effectively. For example, I think about knowledge about scientific research, the usual course of research, and about the involved entities for the professional constraints to which the professionals are subject. The technical language is often an entry barrier for the people whose areas of life are being examined. Where it is essential, we create a glossary and otherwise use slang. Research questions should be asked together. The interests of all parties involved must be considered, the possibilities of financing, how to address target groups, as well as the interpretation and presentation of the research results must also be clarified together. Affected people usually participate in their free time and volunteer on advisory boards, in decision-making processes or in research projects. They do not have a workplace, no employees, no work materials, and they usually have jobs aside their engagement. Therefore, they must be provided with the necessary resources and their time constraints must be thought of. I am committed to ensuring that the time commitment in volunteerism is not only valued but also financially compensated. Otherwise, there will be a huge imbalance when one is paid and the other works for free. Thus, the members of the Survivors Board receive a flat rate compensation of €700 per month. This amount represents, as I said before, 2 full working days per month. This includes the participation in the 2-day meetings every 2 months, the preparation and follow-up of the meetings, participation in specialist events, and participation in statements of the commissioner. In addition to the above-mentioned compensation for expenses, travel expenses for trips to the meetings and the overnight stay at the pre-booked hotel are reimbursed to the members of the Survivors Board. They are also entitled to supervision. In cooperation with employees and volunteers, my motto is main load on the main office. The members of the Survivors Board at the Independent Commissioner for Child Sexual Abuse Issues, the independent processing committees in the dioceses, and as well as the Triological Center Council of the German Center for Mental Health are supported in their work by full-time professionals or even branch offices. I can report that the Independent Commissioner for Child Sexual Abuse Issues, Mrs. Kerstin Klaus, in a dialogue process together with the Survivors Board and the Independent Inquiry into Sexual Child Abuse, develop cross-institutional standards for the involvement of affected people in the processes. Affected persons should participate equally in this process in addition to institutions and people who are already involved in the processes as subject matter experts. I quote the Commissioner, quote, "Involving affected people's expertise is more than just a win for any work-up process. It is a prerequisite for a work-up to have any chances for success. However, it must be ensured that the nature and quality of such involvement are not unilaterally dictated by the institutions or that affected people are instrumentalized in these processes and, at worst, are exposed to new trauma. People need to know from the beginning what their mandate is, what tasks are associated with their involvement, and what support they can rely on. In order to provide both them and the work-up committees with orientation, we want to work together to define criteria and standards for the participation of affected people." Quote end. At the center of the dialogue are questions about what constitutes a successful and genuine participation of affected people in work-up processes, with their participation, where their participation is a profit for the institutions, and what criteria and standards are necessary for this participation to be achieved and ensured. What will apply here for participative processes, processing of sexualized violence in institutions is also relevant for participative research. It's not always easy to attract people with experience-based knowledge. It requires an outing, an interest in research and change, as well as motivation and suitability for collaboration. You may need to reject interested participants. However, if you want to involve those affected in the research, think about the different time structure of volunteers and professionals, carefully select the place of collaboration, and reimburse travel expenses. Plan the phase of getting to know you and compile comprehensive information about research processes. Embrace understandable language and think of the combination of expertise and experience as interdisciplinary work. Address the needs of those affected and anticipate the occurrence of memories of the act of violence and violent feelings. It may be needed to offer specialist advice or supervision. And at the end, I'm looking at our topic with ethical considerations. Ethics play an important role in the participation of victims and sexual abuse in committees and research. It is important that affected people are respected and secure in all phases of the process. They have to be informed of all goals and methods of the project, have to explicitly give their consent, and must be able to trust that anonymity and confidentiality are ensured. The affected people can resign at any time, and their needs and wishes have to be taken into consideration for the planning and execution of the project. In research, the participation of affected people is only successful if the results of the study are useful to the affected people and if they are involved in the application of the findings. I hope that I was able to give you a little insight into well-known participation processes in Germany. I wanted to show that incorporating practical knowledge for me is like interdisciplinary work, and in doing so I wanted to address the specifics of the involvement of affected people. But you know, with the words of the Hollies, perhaps you remember, it's a long, long road from which there is no return. While we are on the way there, why not share? Thank you.